With some exceptions, the British and French led the world in early photographic theory and practice. Some of the directions those earlier practitioners took were photograph as a factual document. By this I mean essentially the science of photography, creating believable likeness or documentation. Another is the photograph as historical witness. The historical witness is a chronicle of human activities and cultures and historic events. This follows in line with history painting, which we saw both in Europe and brought to the early days of America. Also, there were conscious attempts to elevate photography as art. Many of the photographers of this period used some combination of these concepts. Photography is often seen as a mechanical process. Even today, if you tell somebody you're an artist, they assume you paint or sculpt, not that you're a photographer. Even in the vernacular, or the semiotics of words we use in America, like I took a picture rather than I made a picture, talks about the fact that people believe that photography is more mechanical than creative. What follows is some representation of these attitudes in the works loosely created between around 1840 and 1860s. These are photographers that advanced the medium both aesthetically and technically. Anna Atkins was a British photographer. She was trained as a botanist. She developed an interest in photography as a means of recording botanical specimens for a scientific reference book called British Algae, Cyanotype Impressions. The publication was one of the first uses of light-sensitive materials to create a book. The cyanotype process, which is a fancy name for the blueprint, was introduced in 1842 by Sir John Herschel, an Atkins family friend. Atkins applied the process to solve the difficulties of making accurate scientific drawings. She essentially took examples of algae and other botanical specimens, put them in contact with a piece of light-sensitive paper. She then exposed them to the sun, most likely using glass to hold the plant still so it wouldn't blow in the wind. The written pages here are likely written on, again, glass, and then simply placed over a sheet of cyanotype paper. She self-published only 12 copies of British Algae. Only a few remain. She printed and published part 1 of British Algae in 1843, and in doing so established photography as an accurate medium for scientific illustration. In this image, again, you can see the idea, the concept, although this isn't a direct example of this fern. But if you see the picture of the fern itself, if you put that on a sensitized piece of paper, and the cyanotype, before it's exposed to the sun, has this sort of yellowish color. Making a cyanotype, you use 2 chemicals, potassium ferrocyanate and ferric ammonium citrate. Mix them together with distilled water. You coat them onto a piece of paper, one that you can get wet, like watercolor paper. You allow them to dry. Usually can do so simply by putting them in a darkened room overnight. Once they're dry, you can put something in contact with that piece of paper, shine a light through it. Where there are leaves in this case, they would block the light from striking the cyanotype paper, and those areas would still remain light on the print, showing the paper white below. When the sunlight strikes the other areas, it, in a few minutes, simply starts to turn it blue. To process the image, you simply put it under running water, or better yet, in a tray of water. As the water evaporates the parts that didn't harden by the sun, you end up with a photographic image. You can see some of her examples here. And again, not being able to draw these accurately is what led her to look at for the use of light-sensitive chemicals to create these kinds of images. Her interest wasn't necessarily the aesthetics of the image as much as it was to record in scientific, accurate detail the look and size of these plants. She learned the process directly from one of the inventors of photography, William Henry Fox Talbot. Although she owned a camera, she used only the cameraless photogenic drawing technique to produce all of her botanical images. With the assistance of Ann Dixon, Atkins created albums of cyanotype photogenic drawings for botanical specimens. And while her interest may not have been the aesthetics, it's interesting, to me anyway, how beautiful these images really are. Many of them are really quite striking in their simplicity and interest in form. Indeed, if you look on Facebook, you can find a variety of groups interested in alternative photographic processes. Indeed, I think there's one called Alternative Process. And I would say about 70% of the works you see look almost just like Anna Atkins. It's a very simple process. It's an easy process to do. At the end here, I'm going to show you some examples. And actually, if you're interested in making your own cyanotypes, the chemicals are readily available. I'll give you a couple of sources for those. You really don't need a darkroom in creating these images. You simply need a room that you can darken. It could be a garage or a shed, or frankly even a walk-in closet with just a tiny bit of light in it. Indeed, you don't want to spill the chemicals, because once light strikes them, they'll start to turn dark and harden. If you get it on your skin, you can turn your skin blue. I can't imagine it's very good for you. And indeed, you're best to wear gloves, but you can get it. Simple watercolor paper. You can coat them with a brush. In art supply stores, you can usually get a sponge on a stick for just $1 or $2. They're not terribly expensive. You can coat the paper with the mixed cyanotype solution. Again, give it a period of time to dry. You could simply put them in a box and allow them to dry overnight. Once they're dry, you can bring them out into subdued light. In a case like these, that you could simply take leaves and put a piece of glass over it or something to hold them flat, or you could put heavier objects on top of the cyanotype material, anything that will block the light. If it blocks the light completely, if it's essentially opaque, you'll end up with the results that didn't harden, the parts that were blocked. You'll end up with them washing to the color of the paper. So if it's a white paper underneath, it'll wash out to white. Any of the parts that the sun hit will give you this blue hue that you see here. They're very simple, easy. In fact, I did these the first time as a Cub Scout when I was a little kid. As a teacher a few years ago at Chico State, I had a third grade group come in. We had 33 third graders, their teacher and her assistant, and a couple of parents. So we had about 38 people in our dark room. We took tools, scissors, hammers, screwdrivers, and things like that. We coated the paper for the students the night before, but each student grabbed a tool. We simply went outside, put the paper down, put a tool on top of it to hold it flat so it wouldn't blow in the wind. And in about 2 or 3 minutes, the yellowish tone of the exposed paper, the unexposed paper certainly just turns dark. Really just takes a couple of minutes in sunlight, and you bring it in. You could do it in a bucket of water. We had trays in the darkroom, but you just put it in the tray or the bucket. You kind of agitate by rocking the bucket or the tray. Once you get enough of the yellow color that's removed from the unexposed cyanotype material, you dump that and fill it up with a fresh batch of water until the wash water becomes clean. This is an example of cyano t-shirts that we made in one of my alternative photo classes a couple of years ago. I've given you the URL for the address. If you're interested, that would have complete instructions for creating cyanotypes. You can see in the image with me, I simply just used a pair of scissors. We tried to coat the t-shirts with a small square. You can see, and we hung them up. You can see mine had drip marks. Some of the students were much more exacting in how they did theirs than I did mine. But it's a very simple, easy photographic process that you can have fun with. And indeed, I've given you a couple of sources here. Photographer's Formulary sells kits, as does Freestyle Photo. They're not terribly expensive, and again, they're very easy to do. Brought together out of necessity, British artists David Octavius Hill and Robert Adamson proved to be collaborators whose work was as inspired as its impact has been long-lasting. Hill was born to a family in the printing and publishing business. He was trained as a painter, an occupation pursued throughout his lifetime. Hill also was an illustrator and lithographer. His earliest work, Sketches of Scenery in Perthshire Drawn from Nature and on Stone, 1821, published before he was 20, was one of the first in Britain to employ the new medium of lithography. Hill turned to photography as an aid for a commissioned work, a large group portrait of 474 ministers who formed the new Free Church of Scotland. Noting the difficulties of such a monumental task, an associate of William Henry Fox Talbot's introduced Hill to Robert Adamson. Trained as an engineer, Adamson had learned of photography. The portraits necessary for Hill's work were the beginning of their collaboration. The two worked in Adamson's Edinburgh studio in 1843. Hill is generally thought to be the artistic mind behind their images, while Adamson served as the technician responsible for the camera, though this opinion among scholars is shifting towards a greater recognition of Adamson's artistic skill. The portraits of Hill and Adamson are known for their painterly, old masterly quality and exceptional use of light and shadow. Here you can see examples from Rembrandt. You can see the dramatic style of lighting on the faces, often the use of dark backgrounds. Notice the use of the torso as well in his, as well as what you see in Hill and Adamson's work as well. Again, these were made specifically to paint or draw from, but the photographs themselves have their own character and quality, and frankly have had a longer lasting impact than the paintings. The fact that they turned to painting followed traditional known paths towards image making, which was common in the early days of photography. Photography hadn't yet really developed its own style away from the echoes of previous traditions. Other images they made included architecture, landscape, and a series of a small fishing village in New Haven. I'll show you some examples of each of these. They used this calotype saltpaper print, making paper negatives directly contacted to create positive prints. After Adamson's early death in 1848, Hill stopped working entirely for 10 years before continuing in collaboration with a Glasgow artist, but at a considerably diminished level. Some of their fishing village images here. Again, their artistic sensibilities. Look at the way they pose their figures, the use of form, positive and negative shapes, diagonal lines to create tension. Generally speaking, when you see horizontal and vertical lines in a composition, they create static, where diagonal lines move the eye from one place to another, and you can see that in a variety of ways in their images. They create thought-provoking portraits using gesture and facial expression, as well as props. Often you see the people posed with books and other kinds of things to make them look studious or, at times, pious. Gustave Le Gray. He was a master both technically and aesthetically of the early days of photography. He was one of the most important figures in 19th century French photography, bringing to the medium an artistic integrity and visual imagination. Le Gray was trained as a painter, and he was exhibiting his work in the Paris salons in the late 1840s and early 1850s when he became interested in photography. Along with photographers Henri Le Secq and Charles Nègre, he was a student of Paul Delaroche, a painter of considerable reputation and ability, and who was one of the first to grasp the importance of photography. Paul Delaroche, again, was the one that was supposedly quoted as saying when photography was introduced, "Today, painting is dead." Gustave Le Gray was an innovator. He announced an invention of a wax paper negative, a significant improvement over earlier paper methods that were later adopted by others. The wax paper, rather than using a traditional watercolor type paper to create these paper negatives, the wax paper was more translucent, therefore would allow greater detail to show through. One of the complaints of early cyanotypes was indeed the lack of detail. It didn't come close to the kind of detail that you could get with a daguerreotype. But again, the daguerreotype was a one-of-a-kind image. With a negative-positive process, as long as you had the negative, you could make an unlimited number of positive prints. At some point in the near future, you're going to see that processes merge to have both of those characteristics. The detail of a daguerreotype, but the reproducibility of a cyanotype image. I should mention that the early emulsions, again, the light-sensitive chemicals that were used on the daguerreotype plates or with the cyanotype negatives, early emulsions were overly sensitive to blue and undersensitive to red, so they didn't give an equal tonal quality to all of the tones available before them. To create an image like these seascapes that you see, which are some of Le Gray's most famous images, he would actually have to create two negatives. One for the sky, often skies being blue. Blue was overly sensitive in these early emulsions, so skies generally would just come out white. And so he would expose one image for the sky and another for the ground, or in this case, the sea. And he would create what are called combination prints. He would use two negatives, or blocking out half of the image so it's not being exposed to light, while the other part's being exposed to light, probably doing that with a board, cardboard, something similar to that. And then conversely, he would use another negative and print the bottom in while not exposing the top to sunlight. So this multiple negatives which is called combination printing, was also one of his most lasting inventions. Indeed, it's interesting that to create two negatives, and you'll see here that in a case like these two, if I can go back and forth, you'll notice that the sky doesn't necessarily mean that it was the sky taken of that particular place. He would reuse certain negatives of the sky and print them in to separate images, as you see this comparison. This wasn't necessarily manipulation to create false documents. Indeed, it was to give the appearance of greater realism, to make this scene look more realistic rather than just being able to see the sea and a blank white sky. Gave it depth. It also created mood and other kinds of things. It wasn't there to manipulate the fact as it was simply to make a more aesthetic pleasing and a more believable photograph. A few more examples of his prints. The Commission of Monuments and Histories named him as one of the 5 photographers to produce studies of army maneuvers in France. One of the examples you see here. His commissioned studies of historic monuments are classic examples of early architectural photography. Look at the beautiful composition here, the sense of form and volume and repetition, as you see in the architectural details as they radiate out from the center. Again, I'll show you a few examples. I wanted to mention here too, you're going to start to see in one of our next lectures, I'm going to talk about some of the developments in photographic technique. I already mentioned one where they blend the detail of the daguerreotype with the reproducibility of the calotype image, or the use of a negative positive process. Also, saltpaper prints eventually gave way to what's called an albumen print. You'll see that here. And again, in one of our next lectures, I'll cover a lot of the technical things here. But albumen was quickly adopted to create photographic paper. Albumen, some of you cooks will know, is egg whites. Using the egg whites, it creates a smooth, glossy surface that would hold more detail than a calotype image. So you could coat the image with albumen, or coat the paper, I should say, with albumen. Then you would float the light-sensitive solution on that, which would stick. Albumen was the first commercially viable photographic paper as early as the early 1850s, and quickly became the industry standard until almost the end of the century. For example, in 1892, 18 million eggs were used in Europe alone in the making of albumen paper. Much like the gilding of daguerreotypes, albumen prints were generally toned with gold chloride, which warmed the color of the photograph and richened the dark tones. So the sort of yellowish warm tones that you see in this example is very characteristic of an albumen print. Albumens were used from everything from contact prints, which what you're seeing here, to stereographs and cabinet cartes and carte de visites, which are things that we'll learn about again in our next lecture. Gustave Le Gray also worked with Francois Arago, the scientist and champion of daguerre, and later proposed a new method of toning prints among his innovations. He was a founding member of the Société Hélographique and the Société Française de Photographie. Despite his influence and artistic success, Le Gray left Paris in 1865 to become a professor in Cairo. He later died in Egypt. Gaspard Felix Tournichon, who went by the name of Nadar, in many ways typified the best qualities of the bohemian circle of writers and artists that settled in Paris. Born into a family of printer tradespeople of radical yearnings, the young Nadar became interested in many of the era's most daring ideas in politics, literature, and science. After an ordinary middle-class education and a brief stab at medical school, he turned to journalism, first writing theater reviews and then literary pieces. Although a career in literature seemed assured, he gave up writing in 1848 to enlist in a movement to free Poland from foreign oppressors, an adventure that ended suddenly when he was captured and returned to Paris. There followed a period of involvement with graphic journalism, during which he created cartoons and caricatures of well-known political and cultural figures for a Parisian illustrated newspaper in 1848. Nadar produced a lithographic depiction of some 300 members of the French intelligentsia. Only mildly successful financially, it did make Nadar an immediate celebrity. More important, it introduced him to photography, from which he had drawn some of the portraits. In 1853, Nadar set up with his brother as a photographer and took lessons himself, apparently with the intention of joining him in the enterprise. However, despite the evident sensitivity of Adrian's eye for portraits, his lack of discipline, or frankly, his interest in drinking, is believed to have caused Nadar to open a studio on his own, moving eventually to the center of the Paris's entertainment district. Here you can see a photograph of his studio. Nadar was certainly flamboyant, and you can see Nadar written in script across the top of the studio. Often photographers would seek top floors of buildings so that they could create solar enlargers, allowing for light coming through from the sunlight into the studio to bathe the studio in light through these sunlights. He continued his bohemian life, filling the studio with curiosities and objects and entertaining personalities in the arts and literature. But despite his flamboyant personal style, he remained a serious artist, intent on creating images that were both life-enhancing and discerning. Like Hill and Adamson, or in America, Southworth and Hawes, made some of the most striking portraits in the 19th century. And again, like Southworth and Hawes, he often photographed personalities, with the idea that he could sell these images to interested parties. Nadar wrote, "Photography is a marvelous discovery, a science that has attracted the greatest intellects, an art that excites the most astute minds, and one that can be practiced by any imbecile. Photography theory can be taught in an hour, the basic technique in a day, but what cannot be taught is the feeling for light. It is how the light lies on the face that you, as an artist, must capture. Nor can one be taught how to grasp the personality of the sitter, to produce an intimate likeness rather than a banal portrait, the result of mere chance. You must put yourself at once in communion with the sitter, size up his thoughts and his very character." He became part of Paris's entertainment industry. He was flamboyant, frankly an egotist, always looking for ways to capitalize on his fame financially. Ever open to new ideas and discoveries, Nadar was the first in France to make photographs underground with artificial light. Photographs made with electric light, some of the first images of their kind made in the catacombs of Paris. If you're not familiar with the catacombs, these are tunnels underneath the city of Paris that are filled with human remains. They're still open today. My one and only trip to Paris in 2011. We spent a couple hours in line. My 8-year-old daughter decided what she really wanted to do was to go to the catacombs. And so we spent a couple hours in line waiting to get in. There's several miles of tunnels underneath that are, again, filled with bones. Kind of morbid, but it was certainly fascinating as well. He was also the first to photograph Paris from a basket of a hot air balloon. He financed the construction of the Giant, a balloon that met with an unfortunate accident on its second trip. Nonetheless, he was instrumental in setting up the balloon postal service that made it possible for the French government to communicate with those in Paris during the German blockade in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. You can see cartoons of the time of Nadar photographing from his balloon, which was quite a bit larger than you see. And a sequence of photographs made from the balloon. While his financial ruin from the Franco-Prussian War, he nonetheless continued to write and photograph, running an establishment with his son Paul that turned out slick commercial works. In this you can see the self-portrait from various vantage points. If you can imagine, while it's still a ways off yet, you can almost imagine these as moving images. Again, photography led eventually to the development of motion pictures. We'll be looking at that at a later lecture. But in his salon, produced portraits for anybody who would want to come in, but he also attracted celebrities so that he could sell those portraits. He was always a rebel. In 1874, he lent the photo studio to a group of painters who wished to bypass the Paris salons in order to exhibit their work, thus making possible the first exhibition of the Impressionist painters. The salons also didn't allow photography, and you can see in this cartoon of Nadar expressing his outrage, the ingratitude of painting, refusing the smallest place in its exhibit to photography, to whom it owes so much. Although he was to operate still another studio in Marseille during the 1880s and 1890s, Nadar's last photographic idea of significance was a series of exposures made by his son in 1886 as he interviewed chemist Eugene Chevreul, if I'm pronouncing that correct. I took a couple years of French, but my pronunciation is terrible, on his 100th birthday, thus foreshadowing the direction that photojournalism was to take, creating picture stories. This is from a sequence of 27 images. During his last years, he continued to think of himself as a daredevil, always on the lookout for currents to swim against. He died just before the age of 90. Henri Le Secq, another Frenchman, began his photographic career in the late 1840s while still a painter in the studio of Paul Delaroche. With Charles Nègre, a neighbor and fellow painter from Delaroche's studio, Le Secq experimented with the various paper processes of the day. He apparently received instruction from Gustave Le Gray in the wax paper negative process, a process he would continue to use throughout his career. Le Secq was considered one of the best architectural photographers in France and was a founder of the Société Héliographique. He was one of 5 photographers commissioned by Commission of Historical Monuments to create a photographic record of the monuments of France. Le Secq photographed cathedrals and churches surrounding Paris for this project. Here's an example of the negative-positive process. Again, wax paper negative, which give greater clarity, than a traditional paper to make that final print. By 1855, Le Secq had completed the bulk of his architectural work. A year later, however, he produced an unusual group of still lifes that he called his fantasies. Here are the still lifes. Though photography played a smaller role in Le Secq's life in the 1860s and 70s, he did not abandon it altogether. During these years, he reprinted many of his earlier prints, now in either cyanotype or photolithography. So you can see the cyanotype here. Again, cyanotype blueprint. Le Secq's later years were spent painting, supporting the work of contemporary painters, including James McNeill Whistler, and forming a large collection of domestic ironwork. Frenchman Charles Nègre, like Le Secq and Le Gray, at the age of 19, Nègre went to Paris, where he enrolled as a pupil in the studio of master painter Paul Delaroche. In 1844, he saw a demonstration of the daguerreotype process, and a few years later began to make his own. 3 years later, he turned to making calotypes. He wrote, "Being a painter myself, whenever I could dispense with the architectural precision, I indulged in the picturesque, in which case I sacrificed a few details when necessary in favor of imposing effect that would give a monument its real character and also preserve the poetic charm that surrounds it." End of quote. He often retouched his negatives, shading areas and accentuating tonal contrast. His work includes the recording of lifestyles of working class people, studies of street life, and architecture. Again, with a painter's eye, you can see his interest in composition in this image. Look at all the repetition of trapezoidal shapes that you see throughout this image. And again, the dynamic use of diagonal lines that forces and forms your eye or informs your eye to move throughout the frame. You can see his use of a person here in the foreground, partially as documentation, but also to give the surroundings a sense of scale. But if you will, all the lines in the image lead us to that person. Retouching negatives, you can darken an area or lighten it. In Photoshop and in later darkroom terms, this would be called burning and dodging. Although in the early days, instead of giving it more or less light, you could simply draw or paint onto the negative to create these illusions. Again, look at the geometry in the image here, the use of not only trapezoids but triangles, that sense of repetition, and the use of diagonals as our eye moves throughout the image. And also very faintly, you can see woman there in the foreground. Nègre photographed in 1844 in order to collect visual images to use in preparation for his paintings. Unlike many painters who turned to the new medium, Nègre never ceased to paint. He is best known for his landscape and architectural photographs, though, of both Paris and Chartres and the Midi, a region in southern France. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Nègre printed all of his own photographs and was renowned as a photographic printmaker. He retired in 1863 and later died in Cannes, France. some of his photographs of the monuments in and around Paris. Last but not least is another French photographer, Charles Marville. Originally trained as a painter, an engraver, an illustrator, Marville became a landscape and architectural photographer. He traveled to Italy, Germany, and Algeria and used both paper and glass plate negatives. The glass plate, something we'll learn about in our next lecture. In the late 1850s, the city of Paris commissioned Marville and several other photographers, including Henri Le Secq, Charles Nègre, and Hippolyte Bayard, to document the ancient quarters of the city before encroaching urban modernization changed them forever. He worked with cameras as large as 20 by 29 inches, and early in his career produced remarkable calotype prints and later went on to use the wet collodion process and albumen prints. Again, the wet collodion is part of that glass plate revolution, which we'll talk about in our next lecture. Glass plates, even more than wax paper, and certainly more than paper negatives, achieved exquisite detail. You see that in this image and in many of his later works. The idea that he used a large camera, sometimes as large as I said, 20 by 29 inches. At this time, enlarging negatives was nearly impossible. People did devise something called a solar enlarger, which collected sunlight, forced it through a lens, and projected an image which you could project down onto a larger piece of paper to enlarge that negative to a larger print, though they were practically impossible or impractical at this time. So most photographs and most photographers, if they wanted to make bigger images, made bigger negatives. That's something that changes over time as photographic processes became more modernized. Marville photographed the renovations and the new construction, including the new Paris Opera. He was commissioned by the Louvre to make reproductions of artworks in their collection. He is named the official photographer of Paris in 1862. Again, a brilliant photographer, making very beautiful, aesthetically pleasing images, certainly looking to elevate photography as an art, but at the same time documenting Paris and its surroundings. The geometric compositions of his work are really quite exquisite. His use of line, tone, shape, volume, movement, texture, all the kinds of things that make two-dimensional compositions work. Look at the geometry in this work. The use of repetition of squares. You see it in a variety of different ways. Through the doorway, the windows, the squares here, but also in a way dividing right and left side with the lamppost, creating this arresting image. Again, concentrating on composition as well as detail. From today's lecture, moving forward, you should remember who Anna Atkins is. The British photographer who used cyanotypes and used photography for scientific inquiry. Gustave Le Gray and his contributions not only with the wax paper negative, but combination printing. The flamboyant Nadar and his portraits, particularly of personalities and celebrities. cyanotype, again, a fancy name for a blueprint. When you put an object in contact with a piece of photographic paper or light-sensitive paper and simply shine light on it, in other words, Kamler's photograph we would call today a photogram. You should know that term going forward, as well as Le Gray's combination printing using multiple negatives to create one image.